Chapter 99. The knocking sound was urgent. Knock, knock, knock dash. Siddle stood up and looked out the window again. The dark sky covered the road, and in the dense rows of ornamental trees, one could vaguely see half of a face that was white and glowing. Even though it was only a fleeting moment, Siddle still saw it. There was no other reason, mainly because the white mask was too conspicuous in the darkness. Siddle. This stalker didn't seem very smart. Wearing a snow-white mask in the dark, afraid that people wouldn't see her or something. She cursed inwardly, but out of habit, she still had no expression on her face and walked to the door. Knock, knock, knock dash, the knocking sound continued. Siddle looked through the peephole and saw a group of children wearing all kinds of scary masks standing outside. The children were huddled together, their little heads raised, holding candy boxes in their hands, looking very serious as they waited for the owner of the villa to open the door. Siddle had always been in school before, never experienced the entertainment of dressing up to ask for candy, nor had she seen anyone knocking on the door to ask for candy. In a strange mood, she opened the door. A cold wind rushed in. The children raised their candy boxes and shouted in unison, "Trick or treat." Siddle turned around to get the candy. The children's candy boxes were full, so she only put a little candy in each box, to avoid them overflowing. A little girl in the lead lifted her mask, revealing a soft white face, and sweetly shouted, "Thank you, sister, Happy Halloween." Siddle smiled and replied, "Happy Halloween, little witch." But before the children could hastily disperse, she grabbed the little witch, lifted her to the front, and pointed at the doorbell on the door. "Do you see this?" The little girl turned her head around in a daze, looking at her beautiful and gentle older sister with her curved eyes and gentle smile, but she was emitting an inexplicable cold air. "Do you know what it does? Remember not to knock next time, there's a doorbell here." The sound was so loud, banging loudly, even when she heard it, she started to worry if the ghost in the story had crawled out to find her. Anyone who was timid might even get a heart attack. After watching the children leave, Siddle was about to close the door and enter the house, but when she lowered her head, she was caught off guard and came face to face with a child with a sack over his head. The child raised his head wrapped in a sack, wearing a dark orange pajama, the same color as a pumpkin, but it looked dirty and had a few patched holes. This child was very small, only 4 or 5 years old at first glance, and was only half the height of the children just now. Perhaps because of this he was drowned out by the crowd of children. The little boy wasn't holding a box of candy, but was dragging a sack. The sack was probably even bigger than him. The little sack raised its head seriously, slowly opening the sack in its hand towards Siddle. It was empty inside. Siddle. Cute, so cute. Is this a pumpkin cosplay? The little sack hugged its big sack, with 2 black buttons sewn on its eyes. The little boy obediently stood still, raising his head, the 2 black buttons fixedly facing Siddle. Wait a minute. Having a headache because he couldn't handle all the candy, Siddle used his eyes to estimate the capacity of the sack, very satisfied as he turned around to get the candy. A moment later. The little sack, no, it was the little pumpkin head that lowered its head to stare at the sack in its hand. It was stuffed to the brim with all kinds of candy. Done. Siddle finished handling the candies, seeing the little pumpkin looking a little confused, suddenly remembered that this pumpkin was just a child. Although the child looked a little strange, it did not pose any threat. She was quite happy to get acquainted with this cute oddity. So Siddle knelt down and asked in a low voice, "Can I carry this bag?" Should she call a car to take this little pumpkin head home? She originally just wanted to help lighten the burden, but perhaps the little pumpkin head thought that she was worried that he wouldn't be able to lift it. It suddenly shook its head, quickly pulled the bag back into its embrace, hugged it, and carefully tied the mouth of the bag. Under the bag was not a child's head but a real pumpkin head. But no one could see it. The little boy, or rather, he happily pulled the bag and spun it around on the spot as if thanking Siddle. Then, he pulled the big bag up, his small body walked step by step down the stairs, waddling away. Seeing the little pumpkin head gone, Siddle stood up, clapped his hands and prepared to enter the house. The little pumpkin head pulled the sack, his steps also showing joy. He happily walked past the row of ornamental plants next to Siddle's house and suddenly stopped. He suddenly turned his head. In the dark row of trees, half of a pale white mask appeared, as if floating in the air, giving off a somewhat terrifying aura. The white mask faced two black buttons. The child covered in the sack stood still, as if thinking for a moment. He suddenly turned around, dragging his bulging sack towards Siddle's house. Ding dong. When the doorbell rang, Siddle had just returned to the living room. She turned back to open the door, and saw the little pumpkin head again. Huh? The girl was a little surprised. Why did you come back? She ran out of candy, she had already stuffed it all into the sack just now. The child covered in the sack raised his hand, extending a finger to point at the room behind Siddle. Siddle was rarely surprised. You want to come in? The little pumpkin head nodded, looking very serious. Siddle hesitated for a few seconds, then leaned over to look at it. Then are you a good kid? Only good kids are allowed in. If you're not good, I'll smash your head and make that pumpkin cream soup. The little pumpkin head, it didn't say anything, its head tilted, the pumpkin in the bag shook. Siddle originally didn't want to eat pumpkin soup, but after saying this, she was indeed a little hungry, couldn't help but recall the taste of pumpkin cream soup in her mind, unconsciously licking her lower lip. How about cooking some for supper later? The little pumpkin head didn't back down from the blatantly greedy gaze of the girl beside it. It just tried its best to pull its big bag, its short legs stepped over the threshold, then tried its best to pull the big bag over. Siddle, she didn't know why, but she felt like after she said that, it seemed like this child wanted to ignore her. She followed him in, closed the door, and casually asked, Are you hungry? Do you want to eat something, like? Before Siddle could finish speaking, the little pumpkin head took out a lollipop from his pocket as if to express his opinion, and stuffed it into his mouth and hid it in the bag. Siddle, After the little pumpkin head entered, he obediently sat on the sofa in the living room, placed the sack neatly beside him, and sat up straight to eat the candy. Siddle didn't understand what he wanted to do. She didn't plan on going to bed early tonight, so she sat down and started chatting with the child. May I know your name? It seemed like the child couldn't speak, so Siddle took out a pen and paper, and the two of them started chatting. After a while of chatting, Siddle learned that the child covered in a sack and cosplaying as a pumpkin was named Sam. There were many older sisters at home, but they didn't care much about him. They think about seducing men all day long, they don't have time to play with me. The little pumpkin head, no, Sam looked a little sad. The round sack-covered head was slightly lowered, the small hand holding the pen, writing and drawing on the paper. What he said was all true. His older sisters and he were different species. Those older sisters never played with him, nor talked to him. Every Halloween, he would just sit there blankly with a pumpkin. This year, he decided to go out and play by himself and then met Siddle. Siddle was very beautiful, also talked to him and most importantly, gave him a lot of candy. Sam liked Siddle very much, liked her more than his older sisters. Siddle looked at the words on the paper, then looked at Sam's tattered clothes and gray sneakers, and pondered. A few seconds later, she angrily slammed the table. My older sisters are so irresponsible. How can you treat this cute and obedient child like that? Siddle lovingly stroked Sam's head covered with a sack, after feeling a very strange feeling. Unlike the soft feeling of a human body, she put her hand down without changing her expression, and continued, Wait a moment. She went to rummage through the DIY embroidery kit she had bought to play with earlier. Can you help me patch my clothes? Siddle didn't have OCD, but those holes looked really uncomfortable. They made Sam look pitiful, like an abandoned child. After receiving Sam's nod, Siddle hesitantly reached out her hand. After all, since she bought this tool bag, she hadn't touched it many times, and she didn't know what the finished product would look like. But as long as it kept her warm, right? She took a small bench, sat in front of the sofa, and started sewing seriously. Not only did she have the joy of doing crafts, but she also had the secret joy of stealing someone else's little brother. This so-called little brother, of course, the more the better. Sam was sitting on the soft sofa, his older sister in front of him seemed to be carefully sewing his clothes, her skillful movements showing confidence. His little pumpkin head was still a little dizzy, a feeling of extreme happiness rising up, making him feel like he was in a soft white cloud. Is this the feeling of having a big sister? When Belch woke up in the middle of the night, he just went out, and saw the hallway, the light in the living room was still on. He, half asleep, took 2 steps forward, saw Siddle, and vaguely called out, "Big sister, why aren't you asleep yet?" But as soon as he finished calling out, his older sister Siddle didn't turn around to pay attention to him. Instead, a child sitting in front of her suddenly turned her head, 2 shiny black buttons, facing Belch without any hindrance. Belch woke up immediately. He shivered, only to discover that there was another person besides Siddle, who looked very dirty, and didn't know where his sister had picked him up. Belch was used to it, but for some reason, seeing those 2 buttons made him feel a chill down his spine, not daring to say anything more, muttering a few words before leaving. Sam quietly turned his head. On the other side, in the city that was shining with neon lights, the bustling nightlife had just begun. In a bar in a dark alley, a young man sat in a quiet corner.